Here, especially on a Tuesday on the run up to Christmas. We're delighted to host Red Alert in conjunction with the Health Research Board, Vaccines, the Challenges and Opportunities. We've got an amazing panel here this evening, but I just wanted to, before we introduce them, I just wanted to run through the logistics. We're going to have probably about a 30 to 40 minute conversation about the topic, and then we are going to encourage people to engage with the conversation further by having a breakout session. So if you'd like to do that, we'll still be finished by 8, don't worry. If you'd like to do that on your way out the door, if you want to grab a yellow or a green ticket, and if you have a yellow ticket, you can head to Studio 1, and if you have a green ticket, you can head to Studio 2, and we'll just have a breakout discussion on the basis of the conversation here. I'm going to hand over to Sylvia Thompson from the Irish Times, who's going to do all the introductions. Thank you.
Thank you, and welcome everybody this evening. Our discussion will be on vaccines. Vaccines represent the most significant scientific contribution to global public health over the past 200 years. According to research completed by the World Health Organization, the benefits of vaccines far outweigh the minuscule risks. Yet some people still have questions. As part of this exhibition, in case of emergency, and in partnership with the Health Research Board, we have gathered a panel of experts to discuss this controversial but important subject. I work principally as a health journalist in the Irish Times. My primary degree is in psychology from Trinity here, and I suppose my aim as a writer is always to be clear, accessible and non-sensational as a journalist. I'm the mother of 3 daughters aged between 15 and 21, all of whom had their childhood vaccines and were breastfed. And I am, however, the daughter of an 85-year-old mother who has never had the flu vaccine. But that said, I would like to introduce the panel one by one and ask each of them to share with us their key message. And after that, we will open up to the floor for questions, preferably, rather than comments, because we have our experts here, so we really want to use them as best we can throughout the discussion. So we'll start with Dr. Karina Butler, who is Clinical Professor of Paediatrics at University College Dublin and Consultant Paediatrician and Infectious Disease Specialist at Our Lady's Children's Hospital and the Children's University Hospital, Temple Street. She's also a member of the National Immunisation and National Tuberculosis Scientific Advisory Committee. So if we could have your key message, please, Karina.
Thank you, Sylvia. And first of all, thank you all for taking your time and getting so close to Christmas and coming to enter this discussion about vaccines. I'm a paediatrician, and I've worked in the area of infectious disease for a long number of years at this stage. And so I've seen infectious disease come and wane over that time. I'm a mother of 4 children, 3 girls and a boy, and now 2 grandchildren, the youngest of whom is just young enough to begin his vaccines. And honestly, I have to ask myself, why am I taking the time to come and talk with you here today? It's very nice, but it's a bit daunting as well, you know, even this far along in my career. And it's really because as a mother who has children, grandchildren, I really know the benefits of vaccination. As someone within my family and having spanned the generations, I can see it even in that family. Because if I look, my uncle died of diphtheria in the early part of the last century. A member of my family was committed to Cherry Orchard Hospital for 6 months in the early 1950s with polio. My daughter almost died of Haemophilus influenza infection because it was just before the vaccines came in. And now I look at my grandson who had his 6-in-1 and his meningitis B vaccine and his rotavirus vaccine all last week. And I really feel I don't have to worry about those things in him. As Sylvia said, the World Health Organization, vaccination has done more for public health than any other single medical intervention bar provision of clean water. It saves anywhere from 2 to 3 million lives every year. And they're people who can now grow up, have families, who in former times would have succumbed to vaccine preventable diseases. So I really just have 3 messages, 3 points for you to take home, and I'll expand on them a little bit. But vaccines do save lives, and they also prevent disease complications. They prevent children losing limbs from meningitis. They prevent children ending up with brain damage from encephalitis or meningitis. Our vaccines are really safe. And when we stop vaccinating, and many people do it because they think they're doing the best thing for their children because they are misinformed, there are consequences. So there are 3 things, serious consequences to think about. So just think about it. I've already touched on it, but if we look through the diseases, smallpox, it's gone, it's eradicated. None of you even have to worry about getting smallpox vaccine anymore because it's one disease that is eradicated. Diphtheria, in the 1930s, the vaccine came in. It was one of the first vaccines. And at that stage, there were 50 to 70,000 cases per year in the UK, and now virtually never. Rare imported cases. My uncle was 4 when he died of diphtheria. My mother described it very well. Polio. We had the last big outbreak here in 1957, and there were 500 cases. Now, many of those people still have the legacies from polio today, and they were the survivors. In fact, when I talked at the Oireachtas committee hearing, one of the fellow TDs actually suffered the after effects of polio. Whooping cough. I remember having whooping cough as a child. It wasn't very pleasant, but there were 5,000 cases a year in Ireland in the 70s. And now we're down to hundreds of cases a year. It's still a problem. It's not gone away. We still have to tackle it. And if vaccination rates drop, it will come back. And the danger there is to young babies. If they get it in the first 6 months of life, their risk of death is about 80%. So it's very significant. Measles. Globally, there are 70,000 deaths a year, even now from measles. At the moment, we have a small outbreak ongoing, but it was a regular thing here. And when there was the measles scare, the rates went up, and we had 1,500 cases, and we had 3 deaths from measles. Meningitis, I've talked about. Many of you probably remember meningitis, because that's not that long ago. When you heard stories of even students who felt a bit off, didn't go out with their friends, went to bed, and the next day were critically ill with meningococcal infection. And at that stage in Crumlin, I was seeing about almost we were up to a child a week coming into that one hospital. And now it's become a rarity. Our students have almost forgotten what the rash looks like. Vaccines are safe. They really undergo rigorous evaluation, both in the preclinical stages with each of the individual components, and then in the clinical stages, they go through clinical trials, and after all that is done, there is continuous monitoring. Just to take one vaccine that has been in the media lately, the HPV vaccine, it has undergone 7 formal global reviews for safety. That's after licensure. So there is continuous monitoring, because one of the things is we do want to watch out. Not all vaccines have been without problems. I would not say that. We want to have surveillance, watch for problems so that we can act. But the vaccines in our national program are safe. So what happens if we don't vaccinate? Well, you'll hear more from my colleagues, I'm sure, but when vaccination rates fall, diseases re-emerge, because diseases like whooping cough and measles, we haven't managed to eradicate them. We need to have very high rates to protect everybody, and then we get outbreaks. And when we get outbreaks, then, for example, infants, particularly who are vulnerable, might die, and people suffer complications. So three things to remember. Vaccines save lives, they keep people healthy, they are safe, and if we don't use them, there are serious consequences, and some people will lose their lives. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Karina. Now we're going to move. We have on our panel 2 clinicians and 2 scientists. So we're going to move next to hear the key message from Bert Rima. Bert is Professor of Molecular Biology at Queen's University Belfast. His primary degree is in biological chemical engineering. He holds a master's in microbiology and a PhD in bacterial genetics. So if we could hear your key message now, please, Bert.
Yeah, thank you for coming. My main interest in this whole area started in about 1994 when I started to work with the person who created an enormous scare about MMR vaccine, the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, Andrew Wakefield. And that's very interesting in the sense that if you look at that, he was interested in measles, so was I. But after 1 year, it became very clear to me that he wasn't a scientist, and actually it turned out that later on he became involved with almost fraudulent activities in terms of his activity. But what it did show is, and what it taught me is this, that these MMR, let's say the MMR vaccine, needed to be defended against particular claims like the ones that he was making about a link in the first instance to ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease, and later on to autism. He changed his story on several occasions. And so what you see is that you get into a situation where you start to then have to deal with the nuances of science. Scientists can never say this is completely safe. There's always this question. Yes, in many of the vaccines that we have, in 1 in a million cases, we might have well-known side effects that are monitored. And as Karina said, because of the large numbers of usages of these vaccines, we actually can see the small numbers of cases of well-defined side effects that are undesirable. And for example, in the US, there is a vaccine court where people can go to the court and say, look, my child had this particular side effect, and they can get compensation for that if it is a well-known side effect of the vaccine. So this only illustrates the tremendous amount of activity that there is in order to keep these things safe. But safe they are, and they have been a tremendous benefit to society. Measles used to kill 3 million children a year in the pre-vaccine area. When I started in the 70s working on measles, there were still about 700,000 or 800,000 cases of death every year. To put that in perspective, that's about that is 7 jumbo jets full of kids every day dying as a result of this particular disease. And even though we have reduced that now to under 100,000, that is makes measles still the vaccine preventable disease which causes most deaths among children. Now, it is important to realize that the serious side effects that we see from particular informed diseases like measles, it is in the case of encephalitis and another disease which is invariably lethal, which is called subacute sclerosing encephalitis, which occurs many years after the acute disease. We see that these are practically completely and utterly eliminated as a result of the vaccine and the viruses that we use in the control of the disease. I think I want to make one final point, and that is a sort of scientific point which I can elaborate on if people are interested in it, and that is that many of the vaccines that have been developed in the 60s and 70s are empirical vaccines where we passed particular organisms under conditions that were not normal in terms of the human host, and then reintroduced them in the human being, and then they were so-called attenuated and they were used as vaccines. Nowadays, as scientists, we are able to really go into a much more rational way of designing our vaccines. And I think that will increase the safety of the vaccines over the coming decades. But what is important to recognize is this: that unless you see the disease every day, unless you are confronted with it, the rationale for vaccination is there from a scientific, from a societal perspective, is very strong. From a personal perspective, it becomes more difficult, and that is the issue I think that we see in society these days, and as to why there are so many anti-vax groups. Now, over the years, I have fought with Andy Wakefield in various courts, in various countries. The only thing I can say is this: I never tried to affect him and never tried to address the issues to him as a person. But at the same time, nowadays, he still continues in the US with nefarious activities of the kind that he is doing. And I think it is really remarkable to see how a small number of what I would call almost rogues, well, the term scientist doesn't even apply anymore, but rogue people who are driving particular anti-vaccination campaigns through is still having an effect. And I think particularly it is difficult to understand in these days when social media, of course, and a culture of celebrities who are fueling this type of debate leads to a situation where it is very difficult for scientists, at least, to make an impact in that debate, because it is so difficult to counteract all the nonsense that is being promulgated, particularly in social media.
Okay, thank you very much, Bert. Now we're going to move to Dr. Brenda Corcoran. Brenda is a consultant in public health medicine who is responsible for the coordination of all national immunisation programmes in this country. She is also a member of the National Immunisation Advisory Committee.
Thank you very much, and thank you to you all for coming today. Like Karina, I too am passionate about vaccines, and I think that started primarily when my own son developed pneumococcal meningitis. He almost died. Thankfully, he's a strapping 32-year-old now. But now babies are protected against that bacteria. Since 2008, we have introduced this vaccine into our program. And one of the messages that I want to get out is particular to that vaccine. And that is that vaccines protect those children who are vaccinated, but they also protect others who cannot be vaccinated. And why do I say that? Well, particularly about pneumococcal meningitis or pneumococcal disease. That is a disease of young children under the age of 2, and also of older people, 65 and older. And what was found was that when you vaccinated large numbers of children under the age of 2, and when we introduced the vaccine in 2008, we introduced it for all babies, and we did what we called a catch-up for all children up to 2 years of age. And what we noticed was, as has been seen in other countries, was that not only did we protect those children who had been vaccinated, we also reduced the incidence of that disease in the older population. So looking at protecting those who hadn't had the vaccine, you are reducing the level of that infection by vaccinating another population. And that's what we talk about herd immunity. And with regard to herd immunity, what we're talking about is providing the vaccination to enough people within the population to reduce transmission of that bacteria or virus. Generally, depending on which bacteria or virus you're talking about, you need to have uptakes of between 80 to 95% to prevent outbreaks of the disease. And if you do that, you will protect other people who cannot be vaccinated. Karina mentioned pertussis or whooping cough vaccine. Whooping cough is a disease primarily of young babies, primarily of babies under a year or under 6 months of age. They cannot be fully vaccinated because they are too young. So what we do is we vaccinate the pregnant woman with pertussis vaccine. She then transfers her protection through the placenta to her unborn child, and it gives that baby protection during their first few months of life before they have been fully vaccinated by the childhood schedule. So that's providing protection to people who cannot be vaccinated. Similarly, MMR vaccine, it's a live vaccine, cannot be given to people whose immune systems are not working as well, such as cancer patients. We know, unfortunately, there are some children who develop cancer and who are put on high levels of immunosuppressed drugs. They cannot receive MMR vaccine. They rely on other children around them to be vaccinated to protect them from the disease. And generally, if we've uptakes of 95%, that works. But sometimes it doesn't. For example, in the States, in 2004, they had a large measles outbreak in Disneyland over Christmas in December 2004. They had 150 cases. Unfortunately, in Disneyland, there were a number of families who had brought their children who were on cancer treatment, who could not receive the MMR vaccine, and they were exposed to measles because there were measles cases. There was uproar in the States about why do I have to put my child at risk? Does everybody not realize how important it is that you help me to protect my child? And that's one of the key messages, that by vaccination you are also protecting others who cannot be vaccinated. The other message, which is probably even more important, is that misinformation about vaccinations can be dangerous. It can be even life-threatening. Bert mentioned the issue about MMR vaccine and autism. And we've had historically a number of vaccine scares. And unfortunately, vaccines are a victim of their own success. We don't see the diseases that they're given to protect against. So people forget how serious these diseases are. They think the vaccines aren't needed. If you don't vaccinate, the disease comes back. But also people hear misinformation. Bert has already mentioned about MMR and autism, and about how our uptake dropped down to 69%. We had a huge measles outbreak in North Dublin, 1,600 cases and 3 deaths. That was in 2000. We're in 2017 now, and our uptake is only now at 92%, still not at the magical 95% you need to protect against measles, because measles is highly infectious. We've had periodic measles outbreaks since then, and we still have a measles outbreak ongoing today with 20 cases. So it takes time to recover from measles scares. We've already talked about HPV vaccine. Again, uptake up to 87%. Really good uptake, knowing that we could help prevent cervical cancer in women. Vaccine scare. Parents believe the vaccine is not safe. They turn away from the vaccine. Uptake drops to 50%. Interesting that it's just in Ireland, Denmark, and Japan. Why these 3 countries, we're not really sure. But particularly in these days, the main issue is about social media. Parents are bombarded with huge amounts of information, and much of it is misinformation. And the way people access news now is completely different from before. You're cocooned in your bubble of your likes and your dislikes, so you get a certain amount of information fed to you, and that perpetrates the messages. We have to get better at storytelling. That is what helps us to convince parents about vaccines. We have to talk about how serious the diseases are. We have to talk about people who have been vaccinated, who've been protected from these diseases. We also know that in spite of everything, that healthcare professionals are the most trusted source of information. So if a healthcare professional sits down with a parent and talks to them one-to-one, that's really powerful. And that really helps us to get the message across. The other aspect to get the message across is trusted sources of information on the web. And our own immunisation.ie or hpv.ie are both World Health Organization accredited websites. They are the only two immunisation websites in the country that have been accredited as having reliable information on vaccines and vaccine safety. So our messages are to try to convince parents that we know that in countries that have high vaccine uptakes, the population are much healthier than in countries where parents have turned away from vaccines. We're extraordinarily lucky in this country to have a wide range of vaccines available to us, and we should get those for our children to protect them.
Okay, thank you, Brenda. And now we'll move to Ed Lavelle, who's a scientist. He's a professor at the School of Biochemistry and Immunology at Trinity College Dublin. His research interests include nano and microparticles as vaccine adjuvants. His primary degree is in microbiology, and he holds a PhD in immunology. So you could have your key message.
Great,
please,
yeah,
Ed.
thank you. So I'll start with a quote from Albert Camus. Say, to name things wrongly is a misfortune for the world. In some ways, it's remarkable that after 100 years of developments in vaccines, that we have to have an audience where, well, I'm not saying we're not prejudging, but in my experience recently, it's more often seen as a negative rather than a positive. Whereas if you look at historically, after Jenner, Louis Pasteur, Jonas Salk, these guys were seen as heroes in society for alleviating scourges that are our fellow passengers that some people would call microbes. I think it's been highlighted. The bacteria and viruses and parasites that cause diseases haven't gone anywhere. They're all around us all the time. They've been with us since we evolved, and they're not going anywhere. We're defended against them by vaccination. So I suppose I'm here in two roles. I'm the president of the Irish Society for Immunology, and in that context, so that's a voluntary organisation that promotes the understanding of immunology as a discipline. We're very interested at the moment in trying to, among other things, communicate the value of vaccines to society, and to try and do that in a kind of a communicative way, not in a way where someone stands on the stage, but to kind of bring people in, especially now school children by and large come in, we do vaccine games with them, and we try and engage in discussions with them. We'd like to expand that further to adults, not to have someone pontificating. If there's real questions, to have a debate. I was sent a very good website this morning from Colorado where they looked at vaccine uptake in pregnant women that were either just given information dogmatically or were giving access to a website, and at the end of the phone or the computer there was a paediatrician and a scientist. And that kind of iterative sharing of information actually had a big impact on uptake of the vaccine, and more pregnant women adopted the vaccine because it had access to relevant information to them, and they felt like someone was listening to their concerns. So I think there's huge potential this is probably an ideal forum, but to have more genuine debate, because the problem is, if you look up vaccine, or you look up what I work on in the lab, the term adjuvant, we can talk about, they're components that make vaccines work more efficiently and better. But if you do a web search, it's largely negative. These things that have been saving thousands and millions of lives for decades are now seen in a negative context. So I think and accessing information has become very complicated. Even if you look at the scientific literature, you can't be sure that everything you're reading is validated, has been replicated, is the consensus of the scientific community. So I think for people in research, it takes people doing PhDs years to realise you can't trust everything. So I think the only way we can get at this as a society is that the scientists, the medics, and the public get together and try and form a consensus together and not be shouting at each other. In terms of exactly what I do in the lab, what we do is we try to understand how some current vaccines work and how components that we put into vaccines called adjuvants induce and regulate immune responses. So that's one part of it. The second part is a lot of what we're talking about here are vaccines that exist. Unfortunately, for very serious conditions like malaria, tuberculosis, and for forms of cancer where we think there is potential for the immune system to intervene, we don't have effective vaccines. And we think the adjuvants that we're currently using in vaccines aren't good enough. They're either not strong enough or not driving the right type of response for those conditions. So there's a huge gap, actually, for developing more effective vaccines, even for conditions like flu. The ideal situation is you'd have one type of flu vaccine that would work every year rather than having to develop a new vaccine each year, like Group B streptococcal infection and many others are still huge demands. Dengue virus. If you look as well, it depends on the context. So if you look at when Ebola breaks out or Zika virus breaks out, the debate shifts rapidly. People want a vaccine very, very quickly because this is a very dangerous epidemic disease that will affect people locally and travellers to those areas. I think the big challenge is that for diseases that you don't see on a regular basis, people are perceiving the risk associated with the vaccine rather than realizing that if people stop vaccinating themselves, that disease will just come back very, very quickly. I mean, this happened in Russia. After the USSR broke down, they had almost no diphtheria until that point. When the health system fell apart for a couple of years, there was a very rapid increase in the number of cases and the number of deaths. So most of these, with the exception of smallpox and maybe polio in Ireland, most of these diseases haven't gone anywhere. The viruses and bacteria are around you. If you cut yourself in the soil, you can get tetanus if you haven't had a tetanus injection. And that will still be the case in 50 years' time or 100 years' time. So I suppose in terms of what I do in the lab, we think that our research can hopefully develop components that will make future vaccines more effective. And as well as that, we'd like to try and move away from having all the vaccines given by injection, because for some diseases like cholera and traveller's diarrhea, having an oral vaccine would be very attractive, even though that's quite a challenging thing to achieve.
Okay, thank you very much. We've heard a lot of very important facts there, so I'd like to open it out to the floor to have some questions. You can direct your question to a specific member of the panel or generally as you wish. Okay, there's somebody up here towards the top.
Was Andrew Wakefield unique in the damage that he did, or was an Andrew Wakefield inevitable?
Okay, who would like to answer that? Bert, you seem to be the most...
Could you repeat the first aspect of?
Was he unique in the damage that he did, or was there always were we always going to get an Andrew?
Obviously, what it led to was a reduction in the uptake of measles vaccine, and as a result of that, a number of children died both in the UK as well as in Ireland, unnecessarily so. And so, whilst there has been, I've been involved in a review with people about autism in the UK, and there are obviously very interesting aspects of the epidemiology, or let's say of the recognition of that disease. It had nothing to do with MMR vaccine, but he still is continuing in the US now with his anti-vaccination activities. And in that sense, I think it is nefarious because he's making films rather than scientific contributions. The contributions were never that scientific, because after 2 years I realized that we were dealing with a charlatan. And so essentially it is that particular effect that it has had in society which led to unnecessary death and to essentially a complete and utterly misdirected activity by a large number of people who had to try to prove the negative. And this is the difficulty in science, of course, in the sense that I can never prove that vaccine X does not cause disease or side effect Y, because it is extremely difficult to prove a negative association.
Okay.
But I think, just to follow on from that, I think history has shown us that vaccine scares happen over a number of years, so that we had MMR, we had a huge scare, we had the impact, as Bert has ably described, but we didn't learn anything from it, because again, 17 years later, we had a huge scare with HPV vaccine. And we didn't really learn anything from those scares. And what we really need to do is to, as we've already talked about and many of the panelists have, it's about building vaccine resilient populations, so that in good times, in peace times, that people understand the value of vaccines, they understand the science behind them, and they value the vaccines, so that there is a resilience amongst the general population, such that if there is some form of an insult through whatever anti-vaccine media event that there is, that the population doesn't automatically jump to that side. And I think that's our huge challenge at the moment.
Okay.
Can I make one additional point? And it's the following. It's what Brenda already indicated, is the localized nature of these concerns. Right? When we had MMR vaccine scares in the UK as a result of Andrew Wakefield's activity, there was nothing in France or Germany or any of the other countries The French were concerned about hepatitis B vaccine and multiple sclerosis. And so what you see is that these scares are they are localized and very often based on the activity of a very small number of people who find some form of echo in that society. But it's hardly ever an across the world recognition of a particular problem.
Yes, but perhaps now with social media, actually, that could escalate much faster, actually, and spread beyond the local.
Yeah, and I think that's why we are in the same issue as Japan, Denmark, and ourselves for HPV. But that's a very unusual constellation of countries. Our neighbours in the UK haven't seen any fall off. Neighbours in Scandinavia haven't seen any fall off. So, from a scientific perspective, it doesn't make any sense why we are the country who's been affected by this and our nearest neighbours haven't. And I think that's one of the interesting challenges to us.
Yes, okay.
So I think another point is that when real issues do arise, they are dealt with. So there was a rotavirus vaccine developed a couple of decades ago called RotaShield that was associated with intestinal blockage in a small percentage of patients that was found to be a real link with the vaccine. So that vaccine was completely taken off the market and it was replaced by 2 safer vaccines that were put on the market, and that's what you buy now. So I think it's like, I'm not saying that if issues arise, surveillance identifies those issues and those vaccines have to be killed and replaced. And there is evidence that medicine will do that and has done it in the past.
Okay, thank you. Another question? Yes?
Hello. Is enough being done to ensure that the kind of clinical trial data around modern vaccines is all being published? Like we've seen in the past, there's been issues around certain medicines and
so that it's open source, you mean?
Exactly, yeah. So that say bad results get published.
Yes, so the scientists, like Ed, would you like to answer that? Is it open source? Is the information about the clinical trials, or? Yeah,
I don't know enough of the details. I'd be fully in favour of that. But I know in certain with drugs that is a major issue. I don't know enough to be able to answer kind of with authority. I'd be totally in favour of, if it isn't the case, obviously it should be fully open, but I wouldn't be. I don't have the expertise to answer that question.
Karina, would you have anything to add?
Yeah, I certainly in terms of clinical trial data, there's now really very strict and rigorous attention to that both negative results and positive results are published, and if there are any events, the pharmacovigilance around vaccines is very, very intense. So I don't have any concerns that, if you like, that there is data that has been hidden in any way or not revealed in any way.
Perhaps what we need is a kind of a public level of information that is passed down from this very scientific data that can be then passed down to websites that are available to the general public.
I mean, I suppose at some level we have to have trust and build trust in the experts who review this data. And for example, there is the European Medicine Agency and the HPRA and the FDA in the US. And so for any of the vaccine developments, they have to submit all of their files and all of their information to those agencies. And those agencies are tasked with ensuring that all that they need to see is available to them. And I think if you like, the structures around that are now very robust.
Mm-hmm.
So I suppose I could say there are recent examples of negative results being published. So there's a high-profile TB trial with a Vaccinia vector a couple of years ago that was done in Africa that people were very hopeful about, probably for about 20 years, and it didn't work at all. And that's published, it's out there, and it's fully available. There's a couple of examples of very high-profile HIV vaccines that were tested probably over the last 15 years that were totally ineffective. And any of you can look up that data now and realise those vaccines haven't worked. So certainly in those cases, there's full openness in terms of the results of the trials.
Okay, another question? Yes?
I'd be interested in the panel's view on regulation in this area. I guess, as Brenda mentioned, with social media being used as a platform, and anybody now being able to make any claim about anything and it be propagated apparently without any comeback on them. Is there a need now, since the consequences can be quite severe and significant for an overall community, much like in the banking, insurance or other sectors where there's regulation over what you can and can't claim?
You're talking about regulating social media, essentially, there, are you?
It's done for terrorism, so I can't propagate something which would cause harm in terms of racism, other forms of gender discrimination.
So your views are taken down then, if yeah. So is it time that we regulate social media in terms of misinformation about vaccination?
I think that's going to be very difficult to do in the near future, certainly. And I think what we've shown, particularly relating to HPV, is that you can have an impact on social media if you do engage with other stakeholders, as we will call them, liaison people who we have engaged with outside the HSE to help us get our message across, so that the social media is policed, if you like, by people who have information, who are able then to counteract some of the misinformation that perhaps wasn't done in the past. It's much more robust now. If you review the social media airwaves, you will see that there's a much more robust exchange of ideas and of views of people who have viewpoints that aren't scientifically based, that there is much more engagement in that regard. But it is a challenge because it's a 24/7 environment, and most people have other lives outside their working environment. So it is an issue, because many of the people who are in the anti-vaccine brigade are 24/7, and it is a challenge to counteract that. But that's where it comes back to this whole issue of vaccine resilience, by getting the general population to understand why vaccines are so valuable, and to realise and to build this up from school, as we were talking about in the past, that you really have to start from infancy to develop this kind of a coherent population that do understand the value of vaccines.
Yes. I think it's also about those of us that are in the world of medicine or science, realizing that we have to maybe change the way that we have been giving information to people, and sharing the information and making the effort to get it out there. I think we've all been pretty bad at falling into jargon and relying on data tables and not really translating it properly, so that people can get a good understanding and can get the reassurance. But I think that's changing. We're learning, maybe trying to communicate better.
It was also very interesting that the two public health doctors started with their personal experience tonight. I think we were speaking beforehand about, in this age, that the stories do count. So perhaps that the scientists and the doctors also tell their personal stories. Yes, we have another question here. There's one there now, yes.
Professor LaBelle, as a grandfather of 7 children, it's very difficult for me to be confident that the HPV vaccine in particular is safe, particularly when in the trials that were submitted to the FDA, there was no inert control used in the testing. They compared the vaccine with the 4 adjuvants plus the antigen to what they called a control, which had the 4 adjuvants. Now, how is it possible to approve a vaccine like that where there are no inert controls and no differentiation between the 4 adjuvants in the vaccine?
Yeah, I'm not a clinician, so I'd rather...
But this is a matter of science, doctor.
The adjuvant in the vaccine is alum, as I understand it, which has been used for decades in multiple vaccines. So in the diphtheria, pertussis, tetanus vaccine, in the hepatitis B vaccine, this is an adjuvant that's been used for decades. Actually, strangely, the issues around alum are surprising to someone in immunology, because the challenge we have is getting new adjuvants to be adopted into vaccines, because companies are very resistant to leave alum because they see alum as being so safe that there's always a risk of moving from alum to anything else where there isn't the same history of safety. So it has arisen with alum, but it has an exceptional record over decades of being seen as a very safe adjuvant.
Professor, this is a relatively new adjuvant, AAHS. It's not that old. And it has a different form to the older adjuvants. But that doesn't get away from the fact that there was no safety testing done to compare the vaccine against an inert control. And the other adjuvants also have questions over them. They have not been proven to be safe.
Which other adjuvants are in? I mean, alum is the adjuvant, as I understand it, in the cervical cancer vaccine. The other one contains alum.
Sodium borate. There is another one, I forgot the name of it. It's more like it's polysorbate 80. Yes.
But these are largely in there as preservatives and stabilizers. The adjuvant component in the vaccine is alum. Alum activates the immune system to drive antibody production.
The purpose of the additional item doesn't matter. It's the fact that it wasn't tested for safety. Surely.
Sorry.
Maybe I can come in as a clinician. Over 270 million doses of this vaccine have now been in use, and there has been ongoing surveillance and monitoring. As I've said, the outcome of the administrations have gone through more safety reviews than practically any other vaccine. It has been looked at by the EMA, it has been looked at by the FDA, and it has been looked at by the WHO as well. In fact, there's an independent panel of scientists who evaluate all vaccine safety for the WHO. They are totally independent. To be part of that panel, they cannot have any pharmaceutical associations. They're from universities around the world and around Europe. And in their review, which was published in June of this year, they concluded that this vaccine is safe. If there were problems after 270 million doses, it would have become evident. Just to go back to when there are problems, for example, with the introduction of the original rotavirus vaccine, which was introduced, within about 6 months, there were signals that called attention, and immediately the campaign was halted and in fact was stopped while the reviews were ongoing. The issue of vaccine safety is really taken very, very seriously. And as you, with grandchildren and with 4 daughters, if I had any question about the safety of this vaccine, I would not have had my children vaccinated. But I am so glad that I've had my 3 girls vaccinated. And my only question for myself was that I didn't have my son vaccinated. It wasn't part of the program. And I think that's really where we're going forward. There are 130 people in Ireland who die every year of HPV-related cancers. And in fact, last year with a physician friend, we were talking about one 27-year-old young woman who is in terminal stages of cervical cancer. I know of another friend who was in her early 40s with 3 young children. And to think that they could be prevented. There is overwhelming consensus in the scientific community that these vaccines are safe. They have been tested, the components individually, and then in clinical trials and subsequently in ongoing monitoring with over 270 million doses distributed worldwide.
Okay, we'll leave the HPV for now, and
we might just go with one more question, and then what we're going to do is have a breakout session with people if they have any questions or comments. So we might do one more question, if that's possible.
I just have a question about mandatory vaccination. Is it a thing in Ireland?
No.
Yes.
No, vaccination is not mandatory in Ireland. It's a very...
is it mandatory anywhere?
In some parts, yes, for different sections. For example, in the US, for certain schools, you have to have immunization before going to school. The whole issue of mandatory versus compulsory vaccination is a very contentious issue. If you go back through history, there were attempts to introduce mandatory vaccinations in the UK in the time of smallpox, and there were riots on the street. It's not something that anyone wants to do. You really would hope that people can see, can analyze, and recognize the benefits of vaccine and thus do it for themselves and to protect their communities. I know it's an issue that's been raised, particularly, for example, for healthcare workers, whether there should be mandatory vaccines. And mandatory is not compulsory, there's a difference there as well, before they would go in and work in hospitals. But in fact, again, in trying to get out the information and have people really understand the benefits, what we're seeing this year is a marked increase in uptake, for example, in flu vaccine by healthcare workers. And I think that ideally we would like vaccines to be people's choice to get understanding the benefits.
Just to say also that as an opposed to mandatory vaccination, some countries such as France and Australia link the payment of social welfare of children's allowance to vaccine records for children. And I think it should be noted also here that the uptake for our childhood vaccines, our general childhood vaccines, is over 95%. So way in the majority of parents understand the value of vaccines. We already talked about MMR, still at 92, but coming up and increasing all the time. So you're talking about voluntary vaccination that has already delivered high uptakes, and the majority of our nearest neighbours in Europe don't have a mandatory element to their programme. Some do, for example, some parts of Italy have mandatory vaccination, but it does cause problems because some countries then have mandatory for some vaccines and non-mandatory for others. And then, well, what's the value of that vaccine, and is one disease more important than others? And I think we are already going along quite well in terms of our childhood vaccines without a mandatory vaccination policy, in terms of making the vaccinations more accessible, making the information more accessible, and allowing parents to choose what is right for their child.
Okay, thank you very much. We're just going to hear a final thought from each of the panelists, and maybe in the context of overcoming what is a sort of sense that really we need the expert view to be respected, really, in this context. But we'll have a final word anyway from each of you, as we start with you, Karina.
I understand totally that nobody wants to do anything that will harm their child or the young person, and so reasonably they have concerns when they're giving something as distinct. It's different to if someone's sick and you have to treat them. There is a difference there. But I also totally understand the benefits that vaccination affords, even with our newest and perhaps the ones that have stirred up the most controversy lately. The evidence coming out is incontrovertible. The rates of HPV infection are falling. The rates in Scotland, in our near neighbour, the procedures that young women have to go through following a HPV detection or an abnormal smear has fallen in the colposcopy clinics. And that's not nice, having to go through those procedures. I talked about 130 HPV-related deaths every year, but there are 1,000 young women who have to go through procedures, colposcopy, because of abnormal smears. Prevention is better than cure, and the data is, as I said, incontrovertible that these vaccines will save lives. In terms of our childhood immunizations, in the 30 years that I've been in practice, it has changed the landscape. From seeing children every week with meningitis, from seeing, like, I remember one young boy on New Year's Eve coming in, he was a young golfer and he lost 3 limbs to meningococcal meningitis. It is fantastic. To not see whooping cough as often as we did, but it concerns me that we're beginning to see it again. We have to really rely on vaccines to prevent these awful diseases. So I leave that. There are no hidden agendas. There's nothing else. It's really about bringing the benefits to people and to our community. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think what's important is, in particular in relation to what we can do in the future. I think it is to be recognized that what the sort of examples that Karina gives are the very essence of why vaccines are necessary, namely that horrible disease situations are controlled by them. The question is, how can we as scientists and as medical professionals entertain and get involved in that particular social media debate that is now, in my opinion, a very dangerous feeding ground for anti-vax sort of people to be exploited. And that I think it's a very difficult thing, but I think there is an onus on all of us to participate in those types of debates with people. It's too easy to say these people are crazy, and therefore we ignore them. And it is a difficulty because sometimes you're facing a situation where 99% of the people of scientists and medics are of one opinion and 1% is of the other opinion, and somehow there is an assumption that we need to provide some form of balanced view in this, which is completely imbalanced. And I think particularly in relation to climate deniers, we have the same sort of issue where 99% of the people saying there is at least warming, and probably caused by people, and there's 1% that isn't. And if you look at that, those people usually have other agendas than the ones that they are open about. I think it's important for scientists to participate in that debate and make clear that if there are other agendas, that they're exposed.
Okay, thank you.
I think if you look at the number of vaccines that were introduced in the 20th century and the number of vaccines that we've introduced so far in this century, that we've actually introduced more vaccines in the last 17 years than we did in the previous hundreds of years. And maybe that's part of the reason that there is some uncertainty, because things are changing in vaccines. We have better vaccines, and that's a testament to the investigations and the developments of the new vaccines that are coming on board. And that's having a huge impact on public health. But it does also mean that things are changing, that there are new diseases that we are now able to protect children against. And parents are getting lots and lots and lots of information. And that's one of the main messages for us, is about when parents are choosing whether to vaccinate their child or not, they need to consider the source of that information. If you want to get your gas boiler serviced, you must go to a registered gas boiler. You don't look it up on the internet. You don't take a tweet from somebody that you don't even know. But that is what's happening with children's lives. Parents are reading and are believing information from a faceless person. And it's a huge challenge to us to convince them to get information from reliable sources. And that is a huge challenge that we think we are winning, but we've a lot more work to do.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think my last point is along the same lines, that there's a huge I think scientists are failing to communicate with the public, because the reality is this is a golden age in some ways of the products of immunology working in the public interest. So lots of people with arthritis or psoriasis or other autoimmune diseases have been treated with drugs called anti-cytokine antibodies. So TNF, called Humira. There's many other drugs that are changing people's lives. And these are the results of basic research in labs over the last probably 20, 30, 40 years. And patients are getting these drugs, but probably scientists haven't explained exactly what they are, how they've come about, how they work, etc. Likewise, the biggest changes happening in cancer therapy are ways of taking the brakes off the immune system, so the immune system attacks cancer more efficiently. And some individuals have been kept alive by these drugs that weren't there before. So again, I think technology is working in terms of generating products that are beneficial to the public, but there's a failure in the debate and the education of people. I think so. We have to go back and find a way to tell, like it's been said earlier, find a way to tell stories differently so people realise this is taxpayers' money in Ireland and in other countries that's having huge benefits. But I think if you talk to most people in the street, they don't see the connection between what lots of scientists and medics are doing and their own lives. And there's real benefits. I think scientists, we have to find a different way to engage. Maybe this is a start so that we can communicate the value of research to the public.
Yes, in fact, I think that's a very good note to end on. And I think, in fact, this panel has not failed you tonight. And they have very much presented a lot of food for thought and serious information to take home. So I would just like to thank them all very much on your behalf and welcome you to the second part of the evening.
With all topics like this, sometimes it's kind of difficult to